The palace walls shook, not from thunder, but from King Charles finally speaking words nobody within the monarchy wished to hear. Following months of calculated silence, measured smiles, and carefully staged public moments, the king disclosed the reality behind his intention to step down. His physical condition had deteriorated, his vitality was diminishing, and he believed the crown should transfer to William and Catherine before the institution faced irreparable harm. Before we explore what this truly signifies for the royal household, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss any updates. Charles recognized everyone present, grasped the significance of what was unfolding. Mobile devices had been collected, doors had been secured. Only the most loyal advisors remained, sitting motionless with a silence that seemed carefully prepared. The term abdicate, signifying a ruler voluntarily relinquishing the throne prior to death, no longer felt distant. It felt imminent. It felt intentional. It felt as though history had emerged from obscurity into the room's focal point. The king occupied the table's head with weary eyes and a voice struggling to maintain composure. He didn't mention needing rest. He didn't frame it as temporary. He privately acknowledged, through documented palace records, prepared for family archives, that he wished to withdraw because his health was failing and because William and Catherine needed to assume the crown before the monarchy weakened irreversibly. The crown, signifying the royal power and obligation carried by the sovereign, was no longer solely his responsibility. It was becoming their destiny. William absorbed the words motionlessly. The prince had dedicated his existence to preparing for sovereignty. Yet preparation differs from receiving your father's declining strength across a hushed room. He observed Charles not as a monarch requiring replacement, but as a father attempting to depart before obligation consumed him. That's why this moment held weight. It wasn't ambition, it was preservation. It was a son being requested to ascend, while still mourning what his father was surrendering. Catherine perceived what others overlooked. Charles didn't characterize this as a provisional withdrawal. He termed it the sole responsible course. And those words transformed the atmosphere surrounding everyone. The princess comprehended why that mattered, because a provisional retreat could be handled discreetly, but a responsible course meant the decision had already progressed from apprehension into determination. Adjacent to him sat a confidential medical document, a private health assessment meant to clarify the monarch's situation. Still, the king declined to allow anyone to vocalize it. Camilla remained stationary. She stayed positioned as the gathering concluded, her gaze locked on the vacant chair nearby, sensing the foundation shift beneath everything she had struggled to establish. The queen consort recognized that Charles's choice wouldn't merely crown William and Catherine, it could position her outside the power nucleus, observing a future materialize without her consent. Yet before the crown could transition toward William and Catherine, the household had to confront what this decision would demand from each of them individually. Every royal emergency has a visible aspect, but this one carried a private injury. Charles wasn't merely a monarch contemplating abdication. He was a father observing time constrict around him. William wasn't merely the successor, he was a son being requested to enter history before his spirit was prepared. And Catherine, externally composed, recognized that the crown wasn't simply arriving prematurely. It was arriving damaged. Charles bore the suffering, like a confidence that had grown unbearable to conceal. He addressed William in a confidential exchange, subsequently documented in palace records, and for the first instance the king confessed what obligation had compelled him to mask for months. Excessive mournings had commenced with frailty. Excessive public displays had been constructed over suffering. Abdication, signifying a monarch voluntarily relinquishing the throne prior to death, was no longer merely a dreaded term. It had become the direction he believed could rescue the monarchy from fracturing under uncertainty. William occupied the center because Charles believed the prince was the sole individual strong enough to manage the transition without transforming it into disorder. That mattered because a royal transition isn't solely about one individual departing and another arriving. It concerns confidence, stability, and whether the nation believes the subsequent reign is prepared. before the previous one concludes. William comprehended that, but comprehension didn't simplify it. He was observing his father and hearing a king communicate like a man depleting time. Catherine became equally significant because Charles trusted her composure in ways few individuals could command. The crown, signifying the authority and responsibility of royal governance, wouldn't descend on William exclusively. It would descend around their union, their offspring, their destiny, and every quiet sacrifice, still invisible to the public. Catherine knew why that mattered. If William carried mourning into sovereignty without equilibrium, the palace could become more frigid, more severe, and more wounded than previously. Camilla sensed the peril from another section of the room. She feared that Charles' withdrawing wouldn't simply transfer power toward William. It could strand her isolated inside a palace that had never completely embraced her. The queen consort had invested years, positioned beside the king. Yet presently, she feared observing the nucleus of royal existence shift away from her before she was prepared to release it. Anne examined everything without squandering a syllable. The princess observed Charles's stillness, William's ashen silence, Catherine's measured concern, and Camilla's apprehension. Anne comprehended what others were still resisting. The king had already traversed an emotional threshold. When William eventually inquired when his father initially decided this, Charles offered no response. That silence wasn't hollow. It was a passage opening backward, toward the single moment he could no longer disregard. The palace would subsequently recall one evening as the genuine commencement of the conclusion. It wasn't a scandal proclaimed across publications. It wasn't a visible breakdown. It was more subdued than that, and considerably more alarming. During a confidential rehearsal for a significant royal ceremony, Charles halted mid-statement, clutched the table's edge, and regarded William as if the future had abruptly materialized prematurely. Charles attempted to proceed because halting felt like capitulation. The room had assembled for state opening preparation, a rehearsal for the official occasion where the monarch addresses Parliament and presents the government's agenda. That mattered because the ceremony wasn't merely tradition. It was evidence that the king could still convey the crown's voice before the nation. If Charles couldn't complete those words privately, how could he deliver them publicly? William moved before anyone else. The prince observed the transformation in his father's expression and advanced with a son's instinct, not an heir's caution. But Charles elevated one hand and halted him. That singular motion communicated excessively. It communicated pride. It communicated apprehension. It communicated the king still desired command, even as his physique betrayed him. William froze, and in that interval, the future king comprehended that obligation was no longer waiting distantly. It was positioned before him. Catherine observed the silence expand. She witnessed Anne exchange a solemn glance with the medical consultant, and that glance carried more significance than any verbal caution. A medical consultant, signifying the physician trusted to direct royal health determinations, wouldn't respond that way over simple fatigue. Catherine comprehended why the moment mattered. This wasn't one challenging evening. This was evidence that the visible version of strength and the concealed reality of frailty had become impossible to maintain separately. Camilla observed it too, but she declined to acknowledge what it signified. The queen consort watched Charles struggle to remain upright inside his own position, and apprehension solidified into opposition. She knew that if the rehearsal became the justification for abdication, then history wouldn't recall solely his extended wait for sovereignty. It would recall the moment he could no longer complete the words anticipated from a king. Camilla couldn't tolerate that conclusion for him or for herself. Charles expressed little after the room emptied. Subsequently that evening, through documented palace records maintained inside the private household archive, the king requested the succession documents to be delivered to his study. Succession documents, signifying the official planning materials about who follows the monarch and how authority transfers, became the initial quiet advancement toward the decision everyone feared. William didn't know every particular yet, but Catherine perceived the threshold had been traversed. The concealed catalyst had propelled Charles toward surrender, But Camilla's response would transform suffering into confrontation. There are disputes that resonate through corridors, and there are disputes so regulated they become even more hazardous. This confrontation was the latter variety. Behind a secured entrance with no cameras, no courtiers, and no visible script, Camilla confronted Charles and demanded to understand whether he was selecting the monarchy over their existence together. The king didn't raise his voice. That made his response hurt more. Camilla desired the reality from him directly, because every cautious palace expression had begun sounding like betrayal. She didn't desire another aide softening the impact. She didn't desire another confidential note transmitted through the household. The monarchy, signifying the structure where royal power, obligation, and public service are conveyed through the sovereign and household, had suddenly become the competitor in her own marriage. Charles comprehended that suffering, but he also comprehended the greater hazard. If he waited until frailty forced the decision, William would inherit panic instead of arrangement. Charles maintained his voice subdued, and that composure made the room feel colder. He informed Camilla that withdrawing wasn't an escape from obligation. It was the final obligation remaining to him. She responded with the apprehension she had been suppressing. The world would declare he waited a lifetime to become king, then proved insufficiently strong to complete. That statement wounded him. He glanced away, not because he had no reply, but because part of him feared identical judgment. William waited nearby, bearing a silence that felt heavier with every passing instant. The prince knew this wasn't solely a husband and wife disagreeing. This was his father's sovereignty, his own destiny, and the crown's survival colliding behind one entrance. A reign signifies the duration when a monarch governs, and this one had become painfully brief, painfully fragile, and painfully human. William comprehended why the moment mattered. If Charles and Camilla fractured emotionally, the transition would commence with an injury at its nucleus. Camilla pressed harder. She inquired whether he had already envisioned William and Catherine occupying their position, greeting the nation, positioned where he had barely begun to stand. Charles didn't refute it through a documented confidential exchange, subsequently preserved in palace records. The king disclosed that he had imagined the initial days of their reign because he had to know the monarchy would persist without him directing it. The queen consort heard the response and finally comprehended. This wasn't a thought, this was a scheme. Charles positioned his signet ring on the desk momentarily. The motion was minor, but it struck like thunder. A signet ring is a personal royal ring, frequently connected to identity, authority, and household standing, and observing it removed made the decision feel genuine. Camilla stared at it as if the future had been positioned between them. She was furious, but beneath the fury was mourning. The entrance finally opened. William observed Camilla's expression before Charles spoke, and the prince comprehended immediately that the palace was no longer unified. One decision had divided love from obligation, apprehension from responsibility, and marriage from monarchy. And once unity fractured inside the household, the question became who actually possessed the power to advance the crown forward. A crown doesn't transfer because one individual is weary. It advances through law, consent, ritual, and ruthless preparation. Yet inside the palace, power is never solely written on documents. It exists in glances, alliances, old commitments, and the individuals brave enough to act when history becomes unstable. As Charles weakened, the concealed machinery of monarchy began turning toward William and Catherine with alarming velocity. Charles had already traversed the boundary from private apprehension into royal planning. Senior palace officials began preparing transition alternatives after the king acknowledged through documented household records that abdication was presently his preferred direction. Transition alternatives signified the confidential schemes used to decide how obligations, public messages, and authority could transfer from one monarch to the subsequent. That mattered because this was no longer solely emotion inside a household. It was becoming structure. It was becoming timing. It was becoming power. William received the initial framework with the stillness of an individual who comprehended every word could transform his existence. The prince was shown how obligations might shift, how public messaging could be shaped, and how royal authority could transfer toward him and Catherine before the nation even knew the complete reality. Royal authority signifies the official power and symbolic governance carried by the sovereign. William knew why that mattered. If the handover appeared rushed, the monarchy would appear frightened. If it appeared regulated, the crown might survive the shock. Anne observed Charles review the scheme, and sorrow moved behind her silence. The princess had witnessed her brother wait decades for sovereignty, and presently she was observing him prepare to withdraw from it. Charles turned to Anne and posed the question no aide could respond honestly. Would history judge him severely? She didn't comfort him with gentle falsehoods. She informed the king that history would judge whether he protected the crown when protection mattered most. Charles absorbed her words because Anne had never been careless with reality. The princess comprehended obligation in its most difficult form, and he trusted her because she didn't flatter frailty or dress apprehension as wisdom. That mattered because Charles needed more than approval. He needed someone close enough to love him and strong enough to inform him if he was mistaken. Anne's response didn't remove his suffering, but it gave the decision a form he could accept. Camilla's circle sensed the hazard growing. The queen consort's closest voices feared she was being displaced from the emotional nucleus of the monarchy before the transition was even visible. A confidential timetable, signifying a private schedule for possible royal steps, suggested William and Catherine could commence expanded sovereign obligations before any visible constitutional move was complete. That detail struck like a caution. The future wasn't waiting politely. It was already entering the room. Catherine received her own briefing with composed hands and a guarded spirit. She comprehended immediately that the fallout wouldn't commence when the nation heard the announcement. It had already commenced inside the household, inside the marriage, inside every quiet decision presently moving toward her. The machinery was moving, but the initial shockwave landed not in Parliament or the press. It landed inside Catherine's hands. Catherine had confronted pressure previously, but this was different. This wasn't a challenging appearance, a household rift, or a storm of headlines. This was a future being positioned before her, while the present still felt incomplete. When she opened the briefing folder, the words didn't simply describe new obligations. They described an existence, transforming faster than anyone had promised her it would. Catherine read the initial page twice, because one reading wasn't sufficient to acknowledge what it signified. The confidential transition briefing positioned her beside William, not as quiet support, but as a central force in the subsequent reign. A transition briefing signifies a confidential palace document, explaining how positions, obligations, and public responsibilities could transform during a significant royal handover. That mattered because Charles wasn't simply requesting William to prepare. The king was requesting both of them to become the steady expression of preservation. Catherine closed the folder momentarily, not from frailty, but because the weight materialized all at once. The crown had always been near, but presently it felt suddenly close enough to contact, and that closeness carried suffering. The new reign, signifying the duration when William would govern as monarch, would commence while Charles was still alive, still unwell, and still loved. That was why this hurt. It wasn't a clean commencement. It was a future constructed on a father's suffering. William entered and comprehended before she spoke. The prince observed Catherine's expression and knew she had already reached the reality he had been bearing alone. He didn't need to explain the apprehension. She could sense it in the silence between them. William had invested his existence as heir, but heir signifies the individual subsequent in line to sovereignty, and presently that title no longer felt distant. It felt like an entrance opening before he was prepared to advance through. Catherine regarded him with composure. That cost more than anyone would ever witness. She informed William the briefing wasn't solely about obligation, it was about trust. Charles had selected them because the monarchy needed more than a new king. It needed equilibrium, mercy, and a visible spirit strong enough to direct individuals through shock. William listened, and the future king realized She had comprehended the responsibility even before he discovered the words. William finally confessed what Charles had informed him in a documented confidential exchange maintained in palace records. The king had not requested him to prepare for someday. He had requested him to prepare for soon. That single word transformed everything. Catherine held it in silence, because soon signified the household had less time to mourn, less time to adjust, and less space to make mistakes. Catherine reached for William's hand before apprehension could occupy the room. The motion was quiet, but it conveyed more strength than any address. The prince didn't appear less afraid, but he appeared less alone. Catherine didn't pretend the direction ahead would be simple. She simply made it clear they would traverse it together, because in the middle of apprehension, William and Catherine discovered the single thing the crown needed most resolve. The turning point didn't originate from a council gathering. It didn't originate from an ancient regulation or a palace consultant whispering strategy. It originated in a confidential room. After the entrance had secured and the noise had faded, William positioned before Catherine, bearing the apprehension of a son and the obligation of a future king. She regarded him and selected strength before history demanded it. William didn't pretend anymore. He informed Catherine the reality with the honesty of an individual who had depleted safe words. He was afraid of becoming king while Charles was still alive, still unwell, and still bearing the suffering of withdrawing. A council gathering signifies an official assembly where senior figures discuss official matters. But this moment needed no table, no witnesses, and no cautious palace language. It mattered because the monarchy's future was no longer solely visible obligation. It had become their confidential responsibility. Catherine listened without rushing him. She comprehended that William wasn't afraid of service. He was afraid of how the world would interpret it. The crown, signifying the royal authority and responsibility conveyed by the monarch, could appear as if it was being extracted from Charles instead of received with love. That apprehension cut deep because William didn't desire history to observe him as the son who ascended while his father faded. He desired the world to observe the reality. Charles was selecting this to protect them all. William confessed that the timing felt cruel. The prince had always known sovereignty would arrive, but not like this. Not through illness, not through quiet cautions and confidential briefings. Catherine informed him, mourning and obligation could exist in the identical spirit, but apprehension could not be permitted to direct the monarchy. She expressed it softly, yet the words struck with force. If apprehension directed them, every decision would appear defensive. If love directed them, the transfer could become an act of mercy. Catherine then disclosed what Charles had informed her in a confidential documented exchange preserved in palace records. The king had requested her to protect William from becoming emotionally hardened by the crown. That disclosure transformed him. The future king realized his father wasn't simply preparing to abdicate. Abdication, signifying a monarch voluntarily relinquishing the throne prior to death, was becoming Charles's final act of protection. He was withdrawing before obligation transformed his son into someone frigid. William absorbed that reality in silence. The prince observed the decision differently presently. Charles wasn't abandoning sovereignty. He was declining to depart confusion behind. Catherine remained close, not as someone attempting to rescue him from obligation, but as the single individual strong enough to traverse into it beside him. That mattered because a king can wear the crown alone, but he cannot survive the weight of it alone. William finally nodded. He agreed that when the world responded, he would position beside Charles, not in victory, not in hunger for power, but in loyalty. Catherine comprehended what that promise signified. The monarchy wouldn't enter this transformation divided by apprehension. It would meet the visible with mourning, dignity, and resolve. And when the narrative reached the visible, the response wasn't confusion. It was a wave of shock, sorrow, and sudden belief that a new reign had already commenced. By morning, the palace walls could no longer contain the reality. Britain woke to a monarchy positioned at the edge of a historic transfer, and the visible response was immediate. Some individuals were stunned, others were moved, but everyone comprehended one thing. This wasn't a normal royal adjustment. It was the image of an aging king selecting love, obligation, and preservation over pride. Charles became the nucleus of every conversation before the palace could completely regulate the message. Broadcasters framed the narrative with rare seriousness, explaining that the king was preparing to transfer the crown to William and Catherine because his health had made the future impossible to delay. Palace communications, signifying the official team that shapes royal messages for the visible, struggled to protect his privacy while also proving the monarchy was not in panic. That mattered because one incorrect word could make sacrifice appear like breakdown. William positioned beside the narrative even before he positioned before the nation. The prince was characterized as prepared, but nobody inside the palace treated that word lightly. Prepared didn't signify untouched by suffering. Prepared signified trained sufficiently to serve while wounded. The crown, signifying the authority and obligation conveyed by the monarch, was no longer an idea waiting in the distance. It had become a visible expectation pressing against his name, his household, and his destiny. Catherine's position grew larger with every broadcast. Commentators characterized the princess as the steady force who could help direct the monarchy through its most delicate handover in generations. That mattered because the visible needed more than procedure. Individuals needed composure. They needed someone beside William who could make the transformation feel human instead of frigid. Catherine had not requested the moment, but the nation began observing toward her as if she had already become part of the resolution. Buckingham Palace became the location where shock transformed into silence. A minor crowd assembled near the gates, some holding flowers, others positioned still as if noise would disrespect the weight of the day. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main working royal residence in London, mattered because it was where individuals arrived when confidential royal suffering became national history. One elderly woman informed a broadcaster, "He waited so extended to serve, but perhaps this is his greatest service." The words expanded fast because they gave the visible mourning a form. The morning publications made the moment impossible to soften. One front page conveyed the stark headline, "The King's Final Obligation," beside a solemn image of Charles and William. The image hurt because it showed the spirit of the narrative without needing explanation. A father fading, a son ascending, and a monarchy attempting to persist the handover without fracturing its own soul. Charles heard sufficient to comprehend what had occurred. The king was no longer solely making a confidential decision. He was becoming part of a national farewell before he had even withdrawn. As the visible absorbed the information, he prepared for one final confidential gathering with William, knowing abdication no longer signified theory. It signified goodbye. The world had responded. The household had shifted. And presently solely one emotional reality remained for Charles to confront. In the conclusion, the most powerful moment wasn't the disclosure itself. It was what Charles selected to accomplish with it. He could have clung to the crown until the palace bent around his frailty. He could have concealed behind ceremony and silence. Instead, the king acknowledged the most difficult reality of his reign. Sometimes obligation signifies holding on, and sometimes obligation signifies releasing. Charles met William one final instance before the official transition scheme moved forward. The king didn't treat it like paperwork. He treated it like a goodbye. He had been attempting to delay. A transition scheme signifies the confidential steps used to transfer royal obligations, visible messages, and authority from one reign to the subsequent. That mattered because this was no longer solely constitutional. It was a father requesting his son to bear tomorrow, while yesterday still had a heartbeat. William positioned before him with words caught behind mourning. The prince had prepared for obligation, but no training could prepare him for hearing Charles explain that withdrawing wasn't failure. The crown, signifying the authority and responsibility conveyed by the monarch, was not being discarded. It was being transferred before emergency could poison it. Charles informed him he desired his son to inherit strength, not confusion. He desired William to receive dignity, not damage. Catherine remained close, quiet, but deeply present. She didn't communicate over either individual because this moment belonged initially to father and son. Yet her presence mattered because Charles had selected to trust the destiny through both of them. Catherine represented steadiness. She represented the composure William would need when mourning became obligation, and obligation became visible existence. The king observed that clearly presently. He had not simply selected an heir. He had selected a partnership strong enough to maintain the monarchy together. William finally struggled out a response, then embraced his father. The prince didn't need polished royal language. He needed that single human moment where mourning could exist without shame. Charles held him as a father, not as a monarch. And for a few seconds, the weight of history fell away. The future king comprehended then that abdication, signifying a monarch voluntarily relinquishing the throne prior to death, was not an escape. It was Charles's final act of protection. Camilla sensed the reality reach her slowly. The queen consort had been wounded by the decision, but she finally comprehended Charles was not abandoning her. He was surrendering pride to protect the household's destiny. Through a documented confidential exchange, preserved in palace records, the king confessed that observing William and Catherine together convinced him the monarchy would persist beyond his reign. Camilla heard that and knew opposition could no longer transform what love had already acknowledged. Charles's reign didn't conclude in disgrace. It concluded in sacrifice. William and Catherine didn't ascend through ambition. They ascended through obligation. The monarchy persisted because one weary king discovered the courage to withdraw before history forced him to. There was no unresolved mystery remaining, only a father selecting peace, a son acknowledging destiny, and a future queen positioned, prepared beside him. Thanks for observing. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will observe you in next.